All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, July 26th, 1995, we've done Jimmy Carter fending off a crazed rabbit while fishing in a Georgia swamp. Today, we are going to look at the time that former President George H.W. Bush nearly drowned in a peat bog during a fishing trip in Canada. So we really, on this podcast, have the presidents in peril while fishing market totally covered. Here to discuss this story are, as always, Nicole Hammer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And we want to thank is the right word, listener Xavier for recommending this story. There was a one-line email from Xavier, and it says, here's a good obscure story with a link to an LA Times article, which was like 5 lines long. So that's the start of this story, and there's we'll see how much more there is. But, the LA Times article, very straightforward, does not answer, to my mind, the key basic questions, which is, what is a bog? Can you fish in a bog? How do you get stuck in a bog? I mean, there's a lot of bog-related stuff that I want to get out of the way before we get into sort of the massive political ramifications of this. Do either of you know what a bog is?
A lot of assumed knowledge. Yeah.
I assume it's like a swamp, right? I mean, it's sort of like a marshy, yucky, probably gross ground that you think is probably solid until you step into it and realize it's not.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a thick swamp, right? Like it's like a mulch-filled swamp so that it looks like just like a mulchy patch, and then you step in it and like quicksand, you're sucked down.
Yes, and one good definition of bog is it is something that would look like solid ground to a former president. But meaning it is not like a marshland. It is thicker, but it is basically an accumulation of peat and deposits of dead plant materials, often moss and so forth. I think listeners know this, but I'm just going to say it. The distinction between like a bog and, say, a fen. A fen is usually the water is accumulated by like rivers, and bogs are actually more, it's a precipitation that keeps the bog wet. But basically it's the swampiest, thickest version of a swamp. And so then, to my mind, and, LA Times real journalistic failing here, because they refer to Bush being on this fishing trip. And I think it's important to remember he's on a fishing trip, but he's not trying to fish in the bog. And I'm not trying to malign, his fishing expertise here, because as we've just described, I don't think you can actually fish in a bog. All the research I've done on that front is the water's too acidic, there's not enough oxygen, bad idea. But it does seem like Bush was on a fishing trip in Canada, right? And then he decides to go out for a walk one morning?
He's actually with a bunch of people. He's about 17 people deep. Decide to go on this big fishing trip, and as they're getting ready to leave, they were all helicoptered out there. There's about 3 helicopters that they're waiting to get on, but they have to ground the helicopters because there's thick fog and you can't really fly a helicopter in fog. So while they're waiting for the fog to dissipate, Bush decides to go for this walk, and that's when sort of all hell breaks loose. He steps on not so solid ground.
And we should say it's a very good thing that he was a former president, because pretty quickly he's like up to his armpits in this bog, and you're not going to pull yourself out of that. What it actually takes are all of these members of the Secret Service and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police who not only like pull him out, but actually take a long time to get him out. He's pretty good and stuck in this bog for several minutes while several, I presumably burly men try to yank him out of this bog.
Is it bad that the first thing I thought of was like the Princess Bride? Does anybody remember the Princess Bride movie? When they like fell in quicksand and it was like a wrap until they got saved, but it's like crazy. That's where my mind went, sorry.
I was thinking of the quicksand scene in Blazing Saddles, I believe. But yeah, same sort of vibe. And, you know, there are a number of quotes from his spokesperson who says that, you know, he sank up to his armpits, but he was, quote, never so far down that he thought he might not be able to breathe. But you're down to your armpits in this bog. I mean, that's pretty. That's
3/4 of your body submerged.
Yeah. And so, yes, the Secret Service and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers come. They struggle for a few minutes. They're finally able to pull him out. The Newfoundland, I guess we should say this was all in Newfoundland, so it's like in northeast Canada. Newfoundland pilot Craig Dobbin was quoted as saying, quote, I like this, I like the nature, very Canadian nature of this quote, "I wouldn't be truthful if I didn't indicate he was in a very serious situation." So there you go. But very polite way of saying he may have been screwed.
He's 71. Like, he's not as nimble or agile, and the ability to be able to, like, I don't know how many of us can do pull-ups, but like pull yourself out, that's a struggle.
You also have to think, if we're thinking about this as one of the indignities President Bush had to deal with, 2.5 years earlier, he was in the White House, and now he's in the middle of nowhere, Canada, up to his armpits in a peat bog. And it's a long way to sink, metaphorically and in reality.
Though this, of course, this is a president who also threw up into the lap of the Japanese prime minister. I mean, this is a president who's had some of these indignities, and there were no cameras here, like there was with the, you know, I mean, he was an ex-president at this point, so it probably didn't make that big of a splash, so to speak. But, you know, that we did do that, and I mentioned it in the intro, we did do that episode about Jimmy Carter and the quote-unquote swamp rabbit, and that was something that there was a photo, and I feel like the fact that there was this blurry photo and people could then play it up, and obviously Carter was a sitting president at that time, and it played into all these ideas as Carter sort of feckless and, you know, in over his head. And if this had happened, I suppose while Bush was actually president, it really would have, I think, played into a lot of those similar narratives.
For sure. For sure.
So this story has, look, Xavier, thank you for sending this email, but I think we've basically exhausted. We're scraping the bottom of the bog here, right? We're really dredging up the.
He didn't die. There we go.
He didn't die. There you go. This story has not had much of a afterlife. George W. Bush told the story of his father getting stuck in a bog in 2004 when he was on a visit to Canada, talking about the September 11th attacks and talking about the sort of U.S.'s. I don't know. You can imagine George Bush sort of deciding that was a good moment to tell this story. And then other thing that this does bring up, which is interesting, is that there's the afterlife of presidents, right? And so, I mean, George W. Bush is famous for, we haven't done an episode on his paintings, but, you know, he's been doing a lot of painting and so forth. And George H.W. Bush's father, fishing really was his kind of like presidential afterlife, and he went to Newfoundland. We should say he continued the fishing trip. He went fishing the next day. Good for him. Got back out there. But he did go to Newfoundland a lot and fish, and really kind of felt like a deep kinship with that part of the world.
That's right. He was a big fly fisher, and he would even take his grandchildren up with him when he went to Canada. And there's actually, he writes an essay about his experiences fly fishing in Canada. It is very descriptive.
Mm-hmm.
It is perhaps not the most poetic prose I've ever read. a little bit like Grandpa writing you a letter telling you about his day, except this time he's writing it for the newspaper.
That's exactly what it is. He writes this sort of very plain-spoken, grandpa-ish, but it's like that's fisherman talk. That's the way people write about fishing. You know, this is also like a river runs through it territory. Like that's the whole vibe here, and Bush is really sort of, I think you can tell, infatuated by this. But you know, he writes this letter in 1997. He pens this like really long essay and sends it to the Deh Cho Drum newspaper in Fort Simpson, Newfoundland, which is just like this super small regional paper. And the former president of the United States decides to write a letter just kind of talking about how he loves to fish in that part of the world. And I kind of want to do a dramatic reading of it or a not so dramatic reading of it. But, you know, maybe we can fold in some like a river runs through it audio as we do this. But, you know, he writes in part, I know that the Deh Cho Drum paper is not quite the size of the Toronto papers or the New York Times, but you know what? I bet the 800 or 900 readers of your paper know a hell of a lot more about fishing than the readers of those big city papers. That made me hesitant about sharing these amateurish observations with you, but on the other hand, maybe your readers will be better able to understand the exhilarating joy I felt when standing out there knee-deep in the ice-cold waters of the Tree River pools, communing with nature, counting my blessings, thanking God, and yes, catching some char too. I'm a very happy and lucky man now. Because of my time spent fishing and the chance that fishing gives me to relax and think freely, now more than ever I can see clearly just how blessed I really am. I served my country, I have a close family and a wonderful wife to whom I've been married for 52 and a half years. And yes, I went to the Tree River and caught char. Lovely.
I just hear the West Wing music swelling up behind that.
This is so unnecessary. All of this is so unnecessary.
Doesn't it make you want to just put on some khaki pants and shirt with like 19 pockets on it and one of those hats and walk out into the middle of a river and cast for char and think about your wife? No. I don't know. I'm kind of touched.
Sounds like he's got too much time on his hands.
Well, yeah.
He's retired.
All right. He is retired. All right. We did it. We got through that. Thank you, Xavier, for that recommendation. And I suppose to put a little meat on the bones of this episode, we haven't done this in a long time, but there are, let's do some also on this days. So other stuff, maybe more of substance that have happened on this day. So actually, I was looking around on this day, and interestingly, 1943 is when FDR announced the end of coffee rationing in the U.S., which I suppose I knew that there was rationing, but gosh, the idea that we'd have to ration our coffee. And then, FDR did a lot of great things, but this, I think, is the reason why he's actually really popular. He unrationed coffee.
This and ending prohibition. He's really upping the nation's beverage supply.
Yeah. 1969 is when, and this week is when there was the Chappaquiddick incident. We did an episode about that, Edward Kennedy and leaving the scene of the accident at Chappaquiddick. We did do an episode about that. And then, much more serious note, but because we have been touching on this kind of stuff, we did do an episode on 1919 riots in Philadelphia. There was a Chicago, called race riot in 1919 around this time. 15 white people, 23 black people killed, 500 injured. So again, a reminder, right, Kelly, the summer of 1919.
Yeah, Red Summer. Also, Washington, D.C. was that same summer too.
Oh, no, sorry. We did Washington, D.C. was the one that I referenced. We did that episode on Washington, D.C., and this is Chicago. So, yeah. And then in 1967, another year of lots of summer rioting, that's when the Kerner Commission goes into, and that was still, I think, one of the best episodes we've ever done. I think it was with Jelani Cub, but we looked back at the Kerner Commission, and that was around this time in 1967. So, some serious also on this days, and then also a fun episode about bogs and peat. I didn't even mention scotch, which is somehow related to peat, which I like to drink. So thank you, I guess, for that. Bogs. I appreciate that.
You can get the bush quality peat.
Ooh.
Yeah, look, it's a branding opportunity, I think.
Yeah, it is. All right. Nicole Hammer, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kelly Carter Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.